Welcome back to the Tai Chi Code. I'm Dr. Todd Martin. This is lesson number 3, where we are talking about parting the wild horse's mane. This is an important lesson because we're going to take the information that we talked about in lesson number 2 regarding the direction of rotation of our upper waist, our lower ab rotation creating root, and then our hip actions creating power. And we're going to correlate those actions of the core with the 8 energies of Tai Chi. And specifically for parting the wild horse's mane, we're going to be talking about the energies of split, elbow strike, and press. And as we see further videos and further different techniques, you're going to see all of the different 8 energies of Tai Chi represented, correlated with specific movements of the waist. Now, I know this is a novel theory that you're not going to hear anywhere else, but I believe if you follow this channel as I go through the 24 form and other techniques in Tai Chi, and you see how I correlate the core movements of the waist and hips with the 8 energies of Tai Chi, you'll see that it all fits perfectly, and it's going to help you be able to practice your Tai Chi in a more conscious fashion. So let's get into parting the wild horse's mane and how the movements of the core correlate with the 8 energies of Tai Chi, as represented by the Tai Chi trigrams. So first, let's talk about this first movement as we move into empty stance. We're going to begin by understanding the power. We're powering the movement this whole way with flexion of the left hip. Flexion of the hip is one of the ways we can power movements. Hip extension is the other. It's easy to imagine hip extension as we push, powering with the glutes to push off the ground to create energy. When we use hip flexion, instead of using the glutes in the back, we're using the hip flexors in the front to pull the leg up off the ground. And in this transition, we're powering the movement by that pulling action. We can also leave a leg on the ground and power with flexion, like when we do press in Grasp the Sparrow's Tail. Instead of pushing the leg back, I am pulling the leg forward. We can also see that explained in movements like single whip. When I do this motion here, I am flexing my right hip to power. And then at the end of this motion, I am going to change the flexion to extension, and that is going to rotate the hand outward. So that is the difference between hip flexion and hip extension, but we have to always gauge it in correlation with what's going on with the other muscles of the core. So here I'm using hip flexion the whole time. So let me just explain briefly why I would call these yin and yang, because this is my own system. But a yin energy is something that might be considered to be more defensive or retreating, steering away or turning away from energy coming at you, as opposed to projecting energy out towards somebody. And so as we flex the hip, we're retreating into ourself, which is yin. And as we turn the upper waist toward that hip, we are rotating into it, creating yin. Now, if we were to extend the hip, turning our upper waist into an extending hip, it would project the arm out, which would be yang. So turning into an extending hip is yang, turning into a flexing hip is yin. The lower abs are a little bit harder to decipher visually because we don't have arms connected to our lower abs, but the principle is the same. When I'm turning the lower abs away from the flexing hip, you can see the result is my right arm is going to rise and it has some outward energy. But if I turn my lower abs, instead of away from the flexing hip, I turn my lower abs towards the flexing hip, then you can see what happens with the arm. Everything retreats into itself. And this would actually be a rollback energy if we think about the Tai Chi 8 energies. We have a yin energy of the flexing hip, yin energy from the lower abs turning into the flexing hip, and yin energy from the upper abs turning into the flexing hip. Completely retreating energy. And so that is all yin, and that is rollback. But when we take the lower abs and turn them to the other side, now we have a little bit of energy projecting outward because of that. That means the lower abs are creating that yang energy. So that's the first movement in parting the wild horse's mane. That movement is split. So I have yin hip energy, I have yin upper waist energy rotating into that, and I have yang lower waist energy turning away from that. Now what we're going to do to complete empty stance is go from this motion, which is split, to this motion here, which is elbow strike. In elbow strike, we have a yin hip represented by a broken line, and then we have two yang lines representing the waist, both turning away from the flexing hip. So that is going from split to elbow strike. I'll just do a quick demonstration for you to represent elbow strike so you can get your mind around what that might mean, because we don't have an actual elbow strike anywhere in the Tai Chi forms, but I'll show you how, if we understand it from the core energy, we can see how it can be effective to understand things in this manner. When we have press in Grasp the Sparrow's Tail, we have a yin hip, we have a yin lower abs turning towards that hip, and yang upper abs turning away from that hip. So that is press. If we want to change press to elbow strike, what we would do is turn the lower abs away from the flexing hip and towards the opposite hip. So I would be turning my lower abs from left to right. And if I do that, that is what happens. If I take press and then change the lower abs, it creates an actual elbow strike. Flexion of the left hip, yin, and upper and lower waist turning to the right, away from the flexing hip, which causes a counter rotation and causes a strike of the elbow. So that is how these things can correlate, and if you understand them within that context, I think it begins to make some sense. So back to parting the wild horse's mane, we have split, and then we have elbow strike. And then now we're going to step out on the heel. This is an example of the energy of press, which is the third and final energy we use in parting the wild horse's mane. In press, we have a flexing hip. We have the lower abs turning towards the flexing hip, which would be yin, and then the upper abs turning away from the flexing hip, which would be yang. So to turn elbow strike into press, I have to turn the lower abs, rooting the right leg, towards the left side to root the left leg. And that creates the step out. Now I have root actually on the left. Even though my center of gravity is over the right, the root is now on the left, which would prevent somebody from pushing me over because I'm actually rooted on this forward leg. So I've turned elbow strike into press. Now I'm going to wind up before completing parting the wild horse's mane by turning the lower abs back to the right, turning press back into elbow strike, which lowers the forefoot and winds these arms around each other again, and then I complete the motion of parting the wild horse's mane using split. Each time I explain which energy we're using, I generally will call out which leg is creating the power, because they're going to be mirror images of each other. So as I do this motion here, this is split with flexion of the left hip. When I'm completing parting the wild horse's mane, this is split with flexion of the right hip, creating the power. Now let's look at the transition between parting the wild horse's mane left and right and go through each one of the 8 energies that will be used, or specifically the 3 that we're talking about in parting the wild horse's mane. We begin with split with flexion of the right hip as the power. So I shift back, turning the upper waist to the left and the lower abs to the right, powering with flexion of the left hip. That is split. Now I reverse things and do split with flexion of the right hip. And then I use elbow strike, turning the upper waist to the left, and then I step out using press. So my root is now on the right. Change the root to the left, and then split, powered by flexion of the left hip. Split from the right hip, split from the left hip, elbow strike from the left hip, press from the left hip, elbow strike from the left hip, and then split from the right hip. Now I want to show one of the details of the movement that I believe is important, which I've seen missed when other people demonstrate parting the wild horse's mane. And I think we can see what happens if we're not using the core energy correctly. As I shift onto my left leg, I'm first turning the upper waist to the right to begin the motion, and then I create the ball carrying empty stance by turning the waist back to the left. My knee should wind out so it's facing directly forward. I have seen the motion demonstrated where people shift up like this and the knee is still facing at the same angle as the standing knee prior to stepping out. So that is not the wind up that we should be doing. And that would indicate that we have done elbow strike here instead of split. So when the knee doesn't wind out, it means what I've done is shift forward, all with one movement being elbow strike. Upper and lower waist were turning to the left the whole time, so my knee continues turning this way, and I'm not really set up to step out onto my shoulder width stance. For the knee to turn out correctly, I begin turning to the right, then to the left. And so there's already an energy that pulls the knee out into this position, preparing it to step correctly to do the motion of parting the wild horse's mane. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you got value from it, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you can see the other videos as they come out. I will be posting weekly, and the next video that's going to follow this one is going to be a breakdown of the difference between parting the wild horse's mane and slanting flying. So you can see how we apply the core technique analysis to these different movements. Thanks for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.